Thanks. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us to talk about cyber wargaming and specifically Merlin, the cyber wargaming module. My name is Catherine Lee, and I'm a senior research scientist at CNA, and I have with me Dr. Steve Karppi, who is also a senior research scientist at CNA and an expert on operational cyber. And so we're going to be tag teaming on the briefing. I want to first start out by thanking Sebastian and everyone at the Georgetown University Wargaming Society for inviting us to speak about Merlin. We're excited to speak about it and looking forward to your questions and thoughts on the module. I know from looking at the participant list that some of you have already heard this briefing, so looking forward to hearing your thoughts. All right. So I wanted to start out by listing some of the common challenges we've observed in representing cyber operations. And we've seen this across a variety of games over time. This doesn't mean that a game with one or more of these characteristics is somehow wrong. It really all depends on what the war game is trying to accomplish. But it does mean that player expectations of cyberplay and war games is sometimes unbalanced. And so we developed the Merlin Cyber module to transcend these challenges by using clear definitions and structured cyber play. Okay. So Merlin is a cyber wargaming module designed by CNA to increase the realism of cyberplay and wargames and to facilitate discussion between cyber operators and operators from other warfighting domains, from air, land, sea, etc. Our past wargames where we've used Merlin have included cyber operators and operators from the other warfighting domains from U.S. services. We have not played this with foreign military operators to date. Okay, so I wanted to start out with some definitions, the way we use some basic terms. When we're talking about cyber, we're really talking about two things, cyberspace and cyber tradecraft. Cyberspace is a warfighting domain. People in militaries voluntarily connect to it because things like cloud computing and non-local information and information services make them better at what they do. But it also makes them vulnerable to the activities of other players. At CNA, we use the word tradecraft when talking about cyber weapons because they have aspects that are not resident in the cyberspace domain, such as using, say, an unwitting accomplice to put a USB drive into a target device. That is a wargaming action that a player could take, for example, using the Merlin wargaming module. When we talk about war games, the desired outcome is not purely a cyberspace outcome. It involves countries, governments, and militaries acting to preserve their own best interests. Cyber is part of the multi-domain conflict space. We're not describing a simulation of the cyberspace domain. In other words, we're not talking about cyber-on-cyber war games. We're talking about war games where cyber is a part of a broader war game, a broader operational space, a broader warfare. So, what is Merlin? It is a flexible cyber mechanic that requires an existing war game to work from. We designed it as a module that can be placed within a larger wargaming context that can play operational cyber as part of a broader warfight. The Merlin cyber taxonomy that Steve's going to talk to you about allows cyber experts and novices to communicate with each other clearly. It uses also a point of need approach so that players learn what cyber tradecraft they will need in a conflict. Okay, so when we talk about what Merlin can do, it allows players to play at the speed of the war game. Players don't have to pause play. to figure out if their cyber effects worked. And players can use existing cyber tradecraft that they've created, that they know about. We also have a cyber tradecraft library that they can choose from, or they can create an entirely original piece of cyber tradecraft during the game and play it during the game. And what this does is it provides a structure to wargame cyber operations. And it does this by backcasting, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And that associates time and the manpower resources required across organizations to conduct cyber operations. So these are resource limiters. So players can't just create an unlimited amount of tradecraft. It also provides probability of success and burn. Did your tradecraft work? And will it work in the next turn or subsequent turns? Was it burned? Was it discovered by the adversary? It also allows for players to use more resources to meticulously develop their tradecraft, or rush the development of their tradecraft, use less time, but that usually leads to a higher probability of burn and a lower probability of success. So I will turn this part of the presentation over to Steve. And Steve, just tell me when to advance the slides to talk about the analytical underpinnings of the Merlin cyber taxonomy and the data that we use to create it.
Hey, thank you, Kate. Hello, everyone. My name is Steve Karppi, and I'm a senior research scientist at CNA, as Kate mentioned. Okay, so let's get into the taxonomy and the underpinnings of the taxonomy a little bit. Here on this slide, some of the underpinnings. We have reconstructed or gathered data on 22 real-world U.S. operations, and these date back for quite a while, over a decade, and it's both offense and defense. And by using these operations, we were able to create kind of a catalog and to break it into different bins, and I'll talk about the bins here. Two of our bins are access approach and target class, and we also have different effect types. And it's the access approach and target class that we use as the main bins that those real-world operations then get placed into certain cells in that matrix. We've created this at the unclassified level, and that's what I'll be presenting. The data based on that data that we've collected, we also have a time range for each segment of the end-to-end tradecraft scoping, development, and operational execution steps. And we'll talk about that a little bit some more in the next few slides. Okay, Kate? All right, so these are the components of Merlin. It's the taxonomy, which I just talked about a little bit on the previous slide, and then execution. Within a war game, the way execution works is using Mad Lib cards. These are blank cards that the red players and the blue players fill out, and it is how they define what cyber tradecraft they're going to use and for what purpose. And then the analytics. The analytics are handled, at least the biggest piece of our analytics is what we call the backcasting of the tradecraft. And what this gives you is two things, both the development timeline and manpower requirements, manpower usage in order to scope, develop, and then execute a tradecraft. And there's also a cyber magazine depth that comes into play when we play a game using Merlin. We often will give a maximum capacity of your cyber tradecraft magazine, how many different tradecraft you're allowed to have in that magazine. Okay, Kate, please, on to the next one. All right, and so I mentioned the cyber target classes and the access approach classes, and here are the categories. We have 5 target classes, which are listed there on the left, and then the access approach classes listed on the right. And so if you take the 5 target classes and 3 access approach classes, 5 times 3, 15, there are 15 entries where we've placed our real world operations. So those 22 operations, actually the offensive ones are then placed in here, and likewise on the defensive side, which then give you the underpinnings for Merlin. And so you can see the categories there. I think they're pretty much self-explanatory in both cases. The target classes, weapon systems, national military sensors, that would include things like radar systems, satellite systems that provide sensing, and then just jumping down, public media networks, that would be a variety of things, including just plain old email, but also social media, and then the other categories in between. Remote access is traditional hacking sort of access that just via the internet is what that is. Human enabled is where you either a witting or unwitting accomplice is able to get into a facility and take some action there, the way Kate mentioned it, possibly inserting a thumb drive or some other action. And then supply chain is pretty straightforward. That's through components either prior to assembly or possibly during upgrades or just maintenance sorts of updates for a particular computer system. Okay, the next slide, please, Kate. And so here it just shows the actual 3x5 table that we use for the underpinnings of Merlin. And then next slide, please. All right, over to you, Kate.
Okay, sure. Actually, I'm going to go back one slide to the matrix because there was just one more thing I wanted to mention. So for each of these little squares, the end-to-end cyber tradecraft scoping, development, and creation process has different timelines associated with it. So each of the various pieces has a timeline associated with it, and you add those all up, and you get sort of an overall timeline for each of the squares. So if you wanted to use human-enabled access against public media networks, again, the proverbial thumb drive, that would have a different timeline profile than one of the other squares. And the way you adjudicate, how long it actually took is it's a die roll. We've automated that for the Merlin module with a Python-based program that automates the die rolls. But when we play the game off the shelf, we do actually roll physical dice. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the Mad Lib, which Steve mentioned. This is specifically it. So when a player plays Merlin, they have a card that has the above Mad Lib, which is really sort of the heart of the cyber tradecraft creation process. And so the cyber tradecraft they create are a means to an end. Some players do treat cyber like it's a magic bullet that will take away an obstacle without defining what the obstacle is to be removed. And so what the Mad Lib does is it forces players to differentiate between effect and outcome. Steve talked to you about target and access, but we ask players to go a step further. We ask them to define the effect, which is what the cyber tradecraft does, but it's the outcome that shows how the effect changes the situation in the game. Why does that effect actually matter? What does it do that matters in the game? And the latter two, both effect and outcome, are player defined. But at the same time, what that does is it forces players to really think about what they're doing and why it's important enough to do. Okay, so I mentioned early on backcasting. And backcasting is part of the Merlin analytics. It ties into what Steve and I were just talking about. Basically, each time a player creates a cyber tradecraft in Merlin, the spellbook, which I mentioned, which is the Python-based tracking tool, backcasts to determine what needed to have happened in the past to create the effect and outcome a player wants at the point of need in the war game. Different combinations of cyber target class and access approach have different time requirements. Some take longer, some are quicker, like I mentioned on the matrix slide that Steve created. But each process also takes people. And so by putting a limitation on the number of people available in the spell book, for example, you can limit them to the number of people who are employed in the DoD cyber workforce. And what that does is that limits cyber tradecraft players can develop in the war game. And so when we say cyber magazine depth, this is what we mean. You only have so much time, and you only have so much manpower to create the tradecraft you want to create. So it forces players to think about trade-offs. What is really going to matter? What has the best probability of success in this scenario that they're playing? Okay, so when you get down to using Merlin, these are the cards we use to create the cyber tradecraft. And on the left-hand side, you see a blank card. The right-hand side, you see the card filled in. So I will note that this tradecraft card is from the simplified version, the off-the-shelf version of the cyber wargaming module. We have a different version that we would use to play a full cyber wargame. But what you're looking at here is the basics of how you create tradecraft. First, we ask players to give a unique name to each tradecraft. Then we ask them to identify their target type and their access approach. They write down what the effect and outcome are, and we have a results table. So on the right-hand side, the tradecraft that the player chose has those die rolls that you see, and the numbers represent months. So depending on what the player actually rolls, that is the number of months allocated that player will need to allocate to create that tradecraft. In this version of Merlin, it's a 2-year timeline. So players can only fill up 2 years. Then they have the success and burn rate. In this case, it's 75 and 25. The base probability of success and burn we usually use is 80 and 20, but we let players argue if they believe that their cyber tradecraft is going to be different, or if the other player's cyber tradecraft they don't believe that it will work as well, or they don't believe they can't burn it. So anyway, that gets played. Players roll the dice and they create a timeline. Okay. All right, so I'll talk a little bit more about probability of success and burn. So we use these because saying a thing happens does not make it so. As I mentioned, the default we use in Merlin is that an outcome players agree is reasonable will have an 80% chance of success. We use this as a base probability, and like I said, players can agree to modify it. Probability of burn is the likelihood that tradecraft left behind some evidence. If an adversary burns your tradecraft, it cannot be used again. But if that doesn't happen, players can use the same tradecraft again later. And the benefit there is they've already developed it. So if they're able to use it again, it's free in terms of time and manpower for that matter. Okay. So we talked about players and adjudicators agreeing on probability of success and probability of burn. So players also can adjust tradecraft characteristics to improve their probability of success and decrease their probability of burn. But this requires resources. So again, it forces players to prioritize some cyber tradecraft over others. Okay, so when you've played a Merlin game, you end up creating quite a lot of data in your cyber tradecraft magazine and in the Merlin spellbook. So this lists, once you have that data, what can you do with it? You can use it, for instance, to inform future cyber tradecraft development. You can identify areas where cyber tradecraft can and can't make a difference. So if you do this, though, you're going to need more research and analysis. It sort of points to areas that may be fruitful for that research and analysis. You can possibly learn where an adversary may see vulnerabilities in your cyber infrastructure. And also, you can use it to estimate the requirements for wartime cyber operations. How much of the cyber workforce, which types of the cyber workforce are being heavily used at which point in time in the run-up to an operation. Okay, so that concludes our presentation. So we are glad to take any questions you have.
Hey, Kate, this is Sebastian. So I have a couple questions here that were emailed to me ahead of the event. So one of the questions we would like to go into is like, why did you approach cyber warfare in this manner versus other more tactically focused or linked to operations?
Okay, so I can give you the short answer, but then I sort of have a question to come back to. So the reason we designed the game the way we did, or the module the way we did, is because our sponsor expressed a concern that cyber operations were not being accurately represented in Service Title 10 wargames. And specifically, the concern was that players were developing so much cyber tradecraft that it was unrealistic for the current cyber workforce to actually put together that amount of tradecraft. So that's the short answer. But the long answer is, or the question I'd like to sort of throw back is, when you say more tactically or operationally focused, what do you mean?
So I think reading between the tea leaves, their question was like, a lot of cyber games are like, backdoors and breaches, or have a very cyber security focus, like access and how do I get to, a certain information, like very network centric, which is different from how Merlin does it. Was there a reason you skewed away from that?
Yeah, there was, so Merlin is not about modeling the network, and it's not about understanding how the network works and where the vulnerabilities are within the network, which is quite hard to do, because in doing that, you'd be looking at an example network that is limited to a degree. We were really trying to do something different, which is understand how cyber can affect operations, and operations in the terrestrial domains may be able to affect, improve, cyber operations. So we really wanted to explore that interplay at the operational level of war. Steve, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I can add a little bit here. Yeah, I think what you just said pretty much hits it. And so I would just add that the sponsor specifically wanted an operational level cyber module for wargaming. And so what it's doing is it's looking at two nations that are having warfare. Occasionally we'll have the very first game we did, the way we had it was the pre-hostilities portion of the game, of the interaction was included in the game. So there was a period prior to overt kinetic hostilities, and that was just a period of crisis between the two nations. And so during that crisis period, as well as the overt kinetic conflict, there's warfare taking place. Ships, tanks, aircraft are fighting it out, and while that fighting is taking place, cyber is also offensive cyber and defensive cyber operations are both taking place. And cyber, one of the highlights, things we've seen in the games, a couple of games we've done and demonstration games, is cyber can have a real a contribution during the crisis phase prior to the overt kinetic conflict. So in any case, it's how does cyber contribute to a bigger fight between two nations?
Hey, thank you. The next question asks, how does the module incorporate itself into other war games? You mentioned that it can be added to other, I'm assuming, tactical or operational games. How does that work?
Yeah, so essentially, it is how the Joint Force Cyber Component Commander, which is a position that doesn't exist, it would be that position within the larger war game. So if a war game is choosing to incorporate cyber operations, Merlin would be how you adjudicate those cyber operations. And so in a matrix style war game, if you're going around to your warfare commanders, when you went around to your cyber commander, they would talk about their tradecraft, which they can do at the classification level of a war game, which was also a major motivation for Merlin. Is oftentimes cyber capabilities are so very highly classified that players really aren't allowed to talk about them in the larger war game audience. But because Merlin uses such a high level of abstraction, it creates a language and the taxonomy, of course, that players can talk to each other because they're talking in very abstract terms. And so that mechanism allows during the adjudication players to talk about, how did this tradecraft work on the operation it was supposed to work on, it's supposed to affect. So hopefully that answers your question. But if not, please ask a follow-up. And Steve, what would you add?
Oh, I think you covered that. I do see, Sebastian, there's some other very interesting questions in the chat, or any other questions you have.
Oh, no, we'll get through all of them. I have many questions flooding me at the moment. So on the next question, it will say, why did you choose to conflate capabilities development and arsenal management with employment tradecraft? Was there a specific logic or abstraction why you did that way?
Yeah, Steve, do you want to cover that one, because that gets into the taxonomy?
Yeah, at least the way I'm going to interpret the question, and if I'm not actually answering properly, then please let me know. But as I interpret it, the idea is that the players are able to decide what effects they want to generate. And the way I'm going to have to mention backcasting to get to the heart of the question here as I'm interpreting it, is the players are able to decide what effects generation they want to create using offensive cyber during the course of the game. They may be 3 moves into the game. Let's just say they're 3 weeks into the overt kinetic conflict part of the game, and they decide they want to generate a certain effect using offensive cyber. Well, then they backcast at that point, and that will tell them what it took to be able to get to the point where at the end of week 3, they're able to execute and generate the particular desired effect that they want to generate. And so that's kind of the motivation behind it. And the backcasting simply tells you how long it took end to end and how much manpower to develop the tradecraft, to then posture and execute the operation to generate the desired effects that you decided you wanted to generate. And so it was simply our choice, and with the guidance that the sponsor, Air Force Research Lab, gave us. And so that end-to-end, it means, okay, well, we would have needed to start X number of months ago, which may be a fairly big number of months, to do the scoping, how to scope out options for how we may go about creating a certain tradecraft, and then actually creating the tradecraft, and then posturing more from an operational execution point of view, where you're posturing your cyber folks offensive to then be able to execute, and then how long does it take to execute. And so that's the concept there. The magazine depth and constraints. Occasionally in some games we'll put constraints on how much manpower you have available. I hope that answered the question.
If it didn't, please just elaborate in the chat and we can circle back to it. The next question says, sort of related, is when inside the gameplay or turn taxonomy, does the players pick their targets in Tradecraft? Is it pre-game start, during the move, in between moves? Do they get to adjust as the game develops?
So that's a great question, and it actually has been something we've discussed. When we designed it for players to use, sort of right at that point of need as they're planning their moves in the war game. But as we had follow-on conversations with the Air Force especially, we realized that the way players really wanted to create cyber tradecraft was before the game. They wanted to create it, have it adjudicated, essentially, kind of pre-make their cyber quiver, which is absolutely permissible. But players can also create cyber at the point of need in the game, and we actually really encourage them to do so, because Merlin is really about encouraging players to think about how cyber tradecraft could help them or could make them vulnerable in the context of a larger warfight. And so we really encourage the option to stay open to create tradecraft at the point of need. So as to your final option, which is, can you adjust? And the answer is the Merlin spellbook actually doesn't allow you to do that. Once you've committed a tradecraft, its timeline is established, its manpower resources are spent, so you've committed that tradecraft. It's an interesting question about, could you adjust it, like adjust portions of it? And we haven't really explored that. I think if we looked at that and looked at maybe some additional cyber reconstructions where that might have been done in the real world, we could figure out a way to do that. But we really didn't design the module for those sorts of on-the-fly adjustments. And then I'll turn it over to Steve if you want to add anything.
I think you've covered it, Kate.
So on that note, for those in the chat, I'm going to bounce around with some of the questions as they align. So I want to follow up on that line of thinking is, do you have a counter cyber operations mechanism? Are there valid moves and how are they adjudicated?
Yeah, that speaks to the DCO part of the taxonomy, which Steve developed also. So I'm going to turn that question over to Steve.
Okay, on the defensive side, the way we've constructed, at least in the version we've used in actual war games, the defensive side is pretty straightforward. The way we do it is there are we have four categories of characteristics, characteristics of defense, and then and what are those categories? Honeypots is one area. Another area is the hardness of your defense. Another area are sensors, and I don't know if I'm going to remember the fourth one, but there are four categories: honeypots, hardness, and sensors. And you can beef up, you can put more manpower, more resources into the categories. You only have a limited amount of resources to put into those categories, and depending on how, if you beef up the hardness of a networking question, it's more difficult to your probability of success. The adversary's probability of success diminishes, and the probability the sensors then influence the probability of burn. And so what you're doing is you're adjusting the strength of your defenses in these four attribute areas for each defended network. And defended network I'm using loosely there because it's a two-sided it's a symmetric sort of game in the sense of what you're defending are those 5 categories, the 5 target areas. You're defending weapons, you're defending national military sensors, you're defending critical infrastructure, each of those 5 areas that I showed you earlier. And then each of those things, you further break it down into what specifically you're going to be defending within it. And then you have resources that you apply to hardness, sensors, honeypots, and whatever the other category, which I hope I'll remember. So that's how the defensive side works. It alters the probability of success and probability of burn for the other side. If you're blue and you're defending, then it just adjusts those for red and vice versa.
So similarly, following up to that question is, do you ever change the probabilities of success and burn based on defenses without telling the offensive player what the change was?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Well, it's along the lines of what I just said, and so the short answer is yes, we do. The adjudicator, the lead, the adjudicators, the game hosts, they will be the ones who ultimately decide how to shift the probabilities around. But the way CNA does games is there's a dialogue prior to the decision being made by the lead adjudicator, and so blue and red discuss it, and they can argue back and forth of what the probability ought to be, and then the lead adjudicator then simply decides what the 2 probabilities will be: the probability of success and the probability of burn.
Yeah, so to answer the second part of your question, generally, I mean, the way we do war games is they're open information, so the other player is going to know what happened. So we don't do games where we have a player that doesn't know what happened to their cyber operation.
So another question that follows up to sort of the execution of the game is that you discuss matrix games in the sense of like the structure or argument sort of style of game. How can it be used in other types of operational games, referring to Merlin's sort of tack-on ability as a module?
Yeah, I saw that question, Peter Perla. So we've used Merlin in other types of games, yes. Specifically, we've used them in educational type games, and that's why we designed the off-the-shelf version of Merlin, which is very simplified, and we designed it to be played without a facilitator. We've demonstrated that in sort of a variety of venues that have different educational objectives and are interested in incorporating cyber into their sort of general internal education, and that what those goals are really vary by command. So education and training games, and then the Air Force is incorporating the Merlin spellbook into their upcoming Title X game. So that's another example of where Merlin can be used.
So I wanted to follow up on a previous question that got some I needed clarification on, was to follow up on the DCO aspect of the interaction between offensive and defensive cyber activities in Merlin. The question is, can a player commit their offensive cyber operations OCO capabilities for things like botnet takedowns or burning of adversary arsenals, or how would this be adjudicated? Like, for example, using offensive capabilities to go out and touch adversary networks and capabilities in their own arsenals, and their ability to make cyber tradecraft as a sort of preemption.
Yes, Kate, if you don't mind, I'll take a crack at this.
Yes,
we do include that. We do include that. Suppose you're blue and you want to attack the adversary's malicious cyber actors and their ability to develop tradecraft. Yes, we do permit that, and we'll just put that into one of the target categories. We may put it into weapon systems, for example. Yeah, that would be the best fit. Or you could say maybe that it's in the National Military Contractor C4, depending if you're simply going to disrupt the command control communications and computers of the other side, or if you're treating the adversary cyber actors as being a weapon system in a sense. Well, so we would simply put it into one of the target we would assume that the adversary cyber actors and their development efforts reside in one or two of these categories. You can split it up into our target categories. And yes, so bottom line is either side is permitted to do that, and you would fill out the Mad Lib card. You would make use of whatever we do share with both the red players and the blue players our detailed catalog of how long, kind of on average, a Tradecraft will take in each of those 15 cells, the 5 target categories, the 3 access approaches. We do share that with them so they know what the historical typical timelines and manpower usage are, and so then the game would just play out in that fashion. With, if I'm interpreting the question correctly, I hope.
Yeah, it sounds like you hit it on the head there. The other question I guess I want to ask is for both of you, as you guys were approaching creating the taxonomy, but also the game design and sort of the underlying schema and intellectual research that you guys had to do for this game. What were some of the challenges as designers and researchers as you guys were designing Merlin?
So yeah, thanks. That's a really kind of big question. So I'll let Steve get started because Steve really did the underpinning research, and it's really Steve's taxonomy that Merlin runs on. So I'd like to start there, but then I'll speak to the wargaming issues when he's done.
Okay, well, CNA, we had pretty good visibility into the real-world operations, both on the defensive side and offensive side. And this was because CNA was well positioned at OpNav, Navy headquarters. We have had we call it a scientific analyst, a person from our research staff assigned there at OpNav in the N2/N6 directorate. And that directorate dating back many years, for a couple of decades. And that directorate, among other things, it does resourcing for cyberspace capabilities and the manning and manpower for cyberspace operations. And so pretty good visibility there. Also, once Fleet Cyber Command stood up about a little over 10 years ago, we've had what we call a field rep, again, just somebody from our research staff assigned there. So having that visibility into the real-world operations was an enormous advantage for CNA. Not every organization is able to do that. Nevertheless, it didn't mean it was sort of a red carpet that just rolled out and made it easy. We were able to track those, many of the operations, but piecing what we did gather over the years, piecing it together, structuring it in a systematic way, a way that would be useful. It took a lot. It takes effort, and so it take effort to do that. Our data sets were not complete by any stretch, you know. So I do think CNA was positioned to do it, but it still meant that we had to make use of just partial, incomplete data. We had to make choices that were, okay, should we categorize one way or another? You had to make that kind of decision of how to categorize the data that we did have. Let's see, what else? The defensive side actually, in a lot of respects, was more difficult. There was less doctrine there, less solid, reasonable doctrine, Cyber Command and its 4 components plus JFHQ Doden. They didn't come around to a sense, into a decent set of a pretty solid sort of doctrine until, I don't know, I would say maybe 6 years ago, and so on the defensive side. So the defensive side in a lot of ways was more difficult. We did a couple of reconstructions under the AFRL study looking at the defensive side, and were able to, I think, help contribute people. I'm trying to remember who, but I think we actually made a little bit of contribution there, even for folks at Cyber Command, on how we piece together what is kind of a nominal defensive operation. So that's my crack at it. Kate, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of thoughts from a wargaming design perspective. So the design challenges were really aligning our design and our mechanics with what the sponsor objectives were. There's certainly kind of a multitude of ways to wargame cyber, and if you look at other wargamers' designs of cyber, there are a lot of ways you can get at various aspects of the cyber domain. And so, really sort of narrowing down how should we do this was very challenging, and also just, really making a reasonable set of simplifications so that players who were cyber experts, but players also who are non-cyber experts and maybe know very little about the domain, could have a conversation about why cyber matters in the context of the war game was also a really challenging aspect of the design. And Sebastian, I'm sorry, I actually have to step away. Steve can stay a little bit longer, but before I step away, I just want to thank everyone for your fantastic questions. And Sebastian, thank you for allowing us to present to GOOS tonight.
Thanks, Kate. So another question that I want to sort of follow up with as Kate leaves, and we still have a little bit of time with Steve, is there are a couple questions asking about expanding the cyber module for Merlin to include non-state actors or like APTs and other sort of more like non-military context ones. Is Merlin able to do that, or do you guys have plans to move in that direction?
Well, I think it would be possible to extend Merlin to cover non-state actors. I do think that's a possibility. CNA did a self-funded study, I think it was back around 2017, that looked at terrorist organizations' use of cyber, both for just their own internal communications and among different elements of the overall organization who may be scattered at different geographic locations, but also using cyber to attack others. And so I participated in that study, and so I do think it could be expanded to that arena. The non-state actors, their capabilities vary. Some are pretty good at offensive cyber and even, to some degree, cybersecurity. Others, not much. So some may be fairly good, others not good at all. Criminal groups can be, organized crime groups can actually be very good. So it could be done. It would just mean instead of a nation state, the adversary would be either a terrorist group or a criminal group. Does that pretty much cover it? I hope.
I think so. The other question, sort of, I guess we wanted to ask is, what are plans for Merlin moving forward? You said you mentioned considering expanding it to, civilian APT sort of threat vectors, but are there other, plans for Merlin into the future, or is this complete and done?
Well, I think Kate and her bosses at CNA. I'm actually not on the gaming team, but I do know how Catherine Lee and her bosses. I have some sense of what their notions are, and yes, I believe they would like to expand the capabilities of Merlin, expand different some aspects of it would be to do a more rigorous representation of cyber effects within the Merlin taxonomy. That's one area that CNA could potentially move with Merlin. Another area would be to incorporate information operations as part of cyber, and that would mean anywhere from just picture what adversaries do already on the internet, just posting material, disinformation, misinformation, or where it's more of a deliberate delivery of information via cyber mechanisms and rather than posting. So that's another area where Merlin could be expanded. I don't know what else I can say in that area other than Merlin is, I would say, not as fully fleshed out. It doesn't cover all aspects of cyber in the real world, so there is room for additions to it.
That's great. So I have another great question, and I think we have one or two, and then I think we'll wrap up. So if you have any last minute questions, please put them in the chat. As game designers and facilitators, do you ever introduce hidden consequences, or like second or third order effects that the players don't immediately know? So to sort of pull on the thread that sometimes player actions, particularly in the cyber realm, do not have they don't stop at the first order effects, but sometimes can have sort of cascading effects that players may not get to know or be able to predict.
Yes, thank you. We do handle that in our detailed game cards. These are the 15 cards, the 5 target categories, the 3 access approaches. It's more detailed information that we provide to both sides, the red players and blue players. We do include in there nominal third order effects, second order effects. These would be unintended effects that whoever's carrying out an offensive operation could create. And so that is part of gameplay. Kate and I didn't mention it. Thank you for raising it. We do include that in those cards, and it's up to the lead adjudicator to decide how those effects are going to play out. As CNA, the way we do games, I already mentioned, there's a discussion between red and blue, so they're allowed to debate it, but ultimately the lead adjudicator will decide. The way we've done it in games that we've played is the effects are known immediately. I don't think we've ever played it where those unintended effects are hidden at first, but it could be done that way sure, it could be done that way, and I think that would be realistic for some cases where you don't really learn about the ill effects, the unintended effects until later. Anyway, thank you.
So you guys mentioned there is a classified and unclassified version of Merlin. So what were some of the challenges of making an unclassified version about cyber operations in a military context?
Well, thank you. There definitely are challenges in the classification area. I kind of skimmed over. I just brushed and didn't even address that when I gave my remarks earlier. Yes, you have to make sure, and we've gone through a couple different processes of making sure that that the description here is truly unclassified. With Naval War College, we're publishing a chapter in a book, and it's been that chapter discusses Merlin, presents in more detail than what Kate and I presented here today. An overview of Merlin, and that has gone through a clearing for public release process Air Force Research Lab organized. They took care of that process for us. They sent it to the appropriate government office to review it and get it clear for public release. And so we have gone through that, and that book is not published yet, and I'm drawing a blank even on the title of the book, but it's nearing publication. And let me think what else I can say. Even getting to the secret level for many of these operations, it takes effort. You have to be sure to that you're not including any information that's above the secret level. So we've been through that. There was the Air Force wanted us to create a releasable to foreign to our close partner version of it. We haven't done that yet, but yes, there's a process, and it takes time and effort to go through that.
So as we're about to I'll wrap up, if there are no other questions, hold on. Oh, as soon as I speak, there's a question that pops in. Do you think the U.S. military is a little behind in incorporating cyber into higher military education, wargaming, and future command knowledge sharing?
Well, the word behind would be the key question there. It's a challenging area. It's simply difficult. I guess one standard would be relative to industry. It's difficult for me to make that comparison because I'm not sure what industry the private sector is doing. I will say that many of the chapters in that book that Naval War College is publishing, many of those chapters are not really military applications. I think a few of them are. The Merlin one is. But it's hard for me to make the comparison between the the industry side, the for-profit and industry and military. I can just say it straight up. It's been difficult. It's difficult has been difficult for DoD to incorporate cyber into wargaming and to do that in a useful, a highly effective fashion. It's a challenging area. There are a lot of misconceptions about cyber, whether you're in DoD or outside of DoD. A lot of misconceptions, and so I can't really put that keyword there behind. I don't know how to, have they not lived up to what would be a competency? I just think it's a difficult problem. So there have been challenges. I think they're now have made good progress. We'll see how things play out in the next year or 2 years and how that develops. Over.
That's great, Steve. I'll reserve the right for the last question, which is I always like to ask our speakers is if you have sort of unlimited time and money and funding and all this, the whole Red Sea opened up to you, what is a game or research project in your case you would like to do in the future?
Okay, well, thank you, Sebastian. That is a big question. Well, I'm a real fan of wargaming. I'm not a member of that research program at CNA, but I've done a lot of wargames now. I've been a participant either in helping to design a wargame or to just be a participant in the game or a member of an adjudication team in some of the games we've done in close collaboration with DoD organizations. And so I'm a big fan of it. Peter Perla, I think, was on the line here earlier. He was one of the pioneers here at CNA and in wargaming more broadly. And so I would love to be involved in further wargaming, to include maturing Merlin a little bit further. Another area that really needs more development is space. How do you represent space and space effects in wargaming? That's an area that I'm a little bit involved in, here at CNA, and I'd like to be more involved in that. I hope that helps answer, Sebastian, your question a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are all sort of areas of interest for us here, even at Georgetown. Our president, Sophia Chang, who's on the line, is leading, designing a really simple educational matrix game for us and the students on space policy. So that's something that we'll keep you in the loop about. For those who have joined us for our webinar here on Tuesday, thank you. And for those who are watching on YouTube, thank you again. And for those who are interested in the slides, they have been uploaded to our Goose Google Drive. If you need access to it, it will be through our newsletter, which you can sign up for through our website. If you are interested in reaching out to any of our speakers, you can feel free to reach out to us at Goose, and we will forward your email to them. And I'll put our email in the chat box for those who are present, and for those who are watching, you can find it on our website. Thank you again, and have a good night.